It began on a quiet cul-de-sac where every lawn was trimmed to the same height, every driveway free of stains, and every mailbox painted the exact shade of regulation-approved beige. For years, the neighborhood had been governed by an HOA board that prided itself on uniformity. To them, sameness equaled beauty, and beauty meant property values. No one dared step outside the invisible boundaries of acceptable without paying dearly in fines and letters filled with threats of legal action. In this world of rigid control lived Daniel, a homeowner who loved his house but hated the feeling of being policed in his own yard. He had purchased his home for peace and privacy, but with houses pressed close together, it was nearly impossible to escape the constant stares of neighbors. Children ran across his lawn, dogs left unwelcome reminders, and the HOA president, a woman named Margaret, known for her iron fist and clipboard, never hesitated to remind him of community standards. One spring afternoon, Daniel decided he'd had enough of the unwanted foot traffic. He didn't want to break rules, but he also wanted privacy. After careful research, he erected a wooden fence along the boundary of his backyard. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't painted neon, and it didn't tower into the sky. It was a simple, tasteful fence, stained a natural cedar brown, blending with the surrounding trees. To Daniel, it was nothing more than a boundary marker, a reasonable addition to his property. But in the eyes of the HOA, it was nothing short of a declaration of war. Within days, Margaret and her entourage marched down the street with clipboards in hand, stopping in front of Daniel's yard like a firing squad. They measured, scribbled notes, and whispered among themselves with disapproving frowns. The very next morning, a bright yellow violation notice was taped to Daniel's door. It accused him of installing an unauthorized structure that violated neighborhood aesthetics. The letter demanded the fence be removed within 30 days, or fines would begin to accumulate. Daniel was stunned. He had checked the HOA handbook thoroughly. Nowhere did it forbid fences of reasonable height and neutral color. Nowhere did it specify that prior approval was required for a simple backyard enclosure. But the HOA claimed otherwise, insisting he had violated an implied guideline. The battle lines were drawn. What Daniel thought was a personal choice had now become the neighborhood's newest controversy. Some neighbors sympathized quietly, whispering words of encouragement when Margaret wasn't around. Others sided with the HOA, nodding along with every new rule that promised to keep the community in order. As the days ticked by, Daniel refused to remove his fence. Letters piled up. Each one grew more aggressive, threatening legal fees, liens, and even forced removal. Margaret's determination to make an example out of him grew stronger with each passing week. For her, it wasn't about the fence. It was about control. If Daniel could challenge the HOA and get away with it, others might start doing the same. To Margaret, that was unacceptable. Tension thickened in the air. What once had been a quiet cul-de-sac now buzzed with gossip. Cars slowed down as neighbors craned their necks to see the offending fence. Some muttered that Daniel should have asked for permission. Others said the HOA had gone too far, acting like dictators over something so small. The community was splitting down the middle, and Daniel's simple wooden fence had become the battleground. Then came the final letter, a notice of enforcement. The HOA announced they had scheduled a contractor to remove Daniel's fence at his expense. They warned him not to interfere or legal consequences would follow. The message was clear. The HOA intended to win, no matter what it took. But Daniel wasn't ready to back down. Watching Margaret stroll by with her clipboard, smirking at her pending victory, something inside him hardened. He realized this wasn't just about wood and nails. This was about freedom, property rights, and the simple dignity of living in one's own home without constant harassment. So while Margaret plotted his defeat, Daniel began planning something much bigger. If they wanted to tear down his fence, fine. But when he rebuilt it, it wouldn't just be a fence. It would be a statement, one so bold, so unmistakable that the HOA could never ignore it again. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but the quiet cul-de-sac was about to become the stage for a battle that would leave no house untouched. The morning of the fence removal arrived with an eerie calm. Neighbors peeked through their blinds as a white contractor van rolled into the cul-de-sac. The side of the van bore the logo of a local construction company, hired and paid for by the HOA. Two workers stepped out, carrying crowbars, hammers, and rolls of caution tape. Behind them, Margaret marched with her clipboard clutched tightly, her expression smug and unyielding. To her, this was more than a routine enforcement. It was her victory parade. Daniel watched from his living room window, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and resolve. He had read every threatening letter, every line of supposed bylaw, and he knew none of it truly gave the HOA the right to invade his property like this. Yet here they were, acting as if his yard belonged to them. The contractors approached the fence, their boots crunching over the grass. Margaret barked orders, pointing to each panel like a general leading troops. The workers hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Daniel's house, but Margaret assured them the HOA had full authority. That was when Daniel stepped outside. He didn't shout, and he didn't argue. Instead, he walked calmly to the edge of his porch and held up a thick folder. Inside were documents he had spent the last week preparing, copies of the HOA handbook, property deeds, and most importantly, a cease and desist notice drafted by a lawyer he had quietly hired. The contractors froze. Margaret's confidence faltered as Daniel handed over the papers. His message was silent but crystal clear. Any attempt to touch his fence would result in immediate legal action, not against him, but against the workers and the HOA itself. Margaret's face flushed red with fury. She tried to argue, waving her clipboard and spouting claims about unauthorized structures and community aesthetics. But the contractors, unwilling to risk lawsuits, packed up their tools and retreated to the van. They drove off, leaving Margaret fuming in the street. Her plan to humiliate Daniel had backfired. Instead of watching his fence torn down, the neighbors witnessed the HOA president powerless against a homeowner who knew his rights. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip that evening. Some neighbors congratulated Daniel quietly, slipping him notes of support in his mailbox. Others whispered that he was reckless for defying the HOA so publicly. But one thing was certain, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, people saw that Margaret and her board weren't invincible. Daniel, however, wasn't satisfied with simply stopping the demolition. The HOA had declared war, and he intended to respond in kind. He began sketching plans, researching codes, and gathering supplies. If they thought his first fence was a problem, they hadn't seen anything yet. Over the next few weeks, delivery trucks arrived at his home carrying lumber, concrete, and custom metal fittings. Neighbors watched in fascination as Daniel began dismantling his original wooden fence, not because he was giving in, but because he was preparing for something greater. He poured fresh concrete footings, each one deeper and sturdier than the last. He ordered taller panels, reinforced with steel brackets. Where the old fence had been a modest privacy barrier, the new one would be a fortress. At first it rose inch by inch, then foot by foot, until it towered over the yards like a monument of defiance. The HOA board scrambled to stop him, but Daniel was meticulous. Every measurement, every material, every placement complied with building codes and property laws. He followed every written rule to the letter, leaving no opening for Margaret to exploit. What they had once called an unauthorized structure was now a fully legal, fully approved construction that no HOA clause could touch. Margaret seethed as she watched the new fence take shape. The once open sightlines of the cul-de-sac were gone, replaced by a wall that shielded Daniel's yard completely from view. Her clipboard notes grew longer and more frantic, but every attempt to issue a violation came back stamped void once Daniel sent proof of compliance. The fence soon became the talk of the entire community. Some neighbors admired Daniel's determination, calling him a hero for standing up to the HOA. Others grumbled that the fence was too much, claiming it made the street feel divided. But deep down, everyone knew it was more than just wood and nails. It was a message carved into the landscape. A message that said the HOA's reign of unchecked control was no longer absolute. Margaret, humiliated and desperate to regain authority, began plotting her next move. She called emergency board meetings, drafted new proposed rules, and even hinted at lawsuits. But Daniel wasn't intimidated. With his fence standing tall and his documents airtight, he was prepared for whatever the HOA threw at him next. The war was far from over. What began as a simple fence dispute had now escalated into a full-scale neighborhood battle, one that would test loyalties, push boundaries, and ultimately decide who truly held power on that quiet cul-de-sac. The new fence stood tall and unyielding, casting a long shadow across the cul-de-sac. It wasn't just a barrier of wood and steel. It was a symbol, one that could be seen from every angle of the neighborhood. Each morning, as neighbors stepped outside to fetch their newspapers or start their cars, their eyes inevitably landed on it. Some saw strength, others saw defiance, but everyone felt its presence. For Margaret, the HOA president, the sight was intolerable. She had ruled the community for nearly a decade, priding herself on her ability to maintain order. With her clipboard in hand and the backing of the board, she had silenced countless complaints, fined countless homeowners, and forced compliance through sheer intimidation. But now, her authority was slipping through her fingers. Daniel's fence was not just legal. It was a victory that mocked her control every single day. Margaret called an emergency board meeting at the community clubhouse. The fluorescent lights hummed as she stood at the podium, her voice sharp as she outlined her plan to restore harmony. She proposed a new set of rules, regulations on fence height, color, materials, and placement. These rules, if passed, would target Daniel directly, rendering his massive fence non-compliant. To her, rewriting the rules was the only way to strike back. But cracks in her influence were starting to show. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew the neighborhood was buzzing, and not in Margaret's favor. Many homeowners were tired of her heavy-handed tactics. Daniel A.'s stand had ignited something in them, a thought they hadn't dared to voice before. Maybe they didn't need to be ruled by fear. Outside the clubhouse, those whispers were spreading. Neighbors who had once cowered at violation notices now shared stories of Margaret's petty power plays. One family recalled being fined for a flower pot in the wrong color. Another remembered being threatened over a child's basketball hoop. The more people talked, the more they realized they weren't alone. Daniel hadn't set out to lead a movement, but the fence had made him the unwilling face of resistance. Neighbors began approaching him quietly, offering support. Some slipped HOA documents under his door, exposing inconsistencies in the board's decisions. Others shared stories of Margaret bending the rules for her friends, while punishing others harshly. Word traveled fast, and soon the fence wasn't just Daniel's battle, it was the neighborhood's. The cul-de-sac that once whispered in fear was now buzzing with defiance. The fence had given them something they never had before, proof that standing up to the HOA was possible. Margaret, sensing her grip slipping, resorted to more underhanded tactics. Late at night, she and a select few allies held secret meetings, drafting letters filled with exaggerated claims. They accused Daniel of lowering property values, of creating an eyesore, of being a danger to community unity. Flyers appeared in mailboxes urging residents to take action against him. It was a smear campaign, designed to turn the neighborhood against its new symbol of resistance. But the plan backfired. Instead of isolating Daniel, it only made the board look desperate. The more they tried to paint him as the villain, the more people saw the truth. The HOA's obsession with control was the real problem. Daniel remained quiet, letting the fence speak for itself. His calmness in the face of hostility only strengthened his position. Neighbors began rallying around him openly, speaking up at board meetings, questioning Margaret's authority. For the first time in years, the HOA president found herself interrupted, challenged, and even laughed at during her speeches. The fence had shifted the balance of power. What started as a single man's stand for privacy had become a neighborhood-wide awakening. Margaret, once untouchable, now faced the possibility of losing everything she had built her identity on. But Margaret was not someone who admitted defeat easily. If the whispers had turned into a movement, then she would strike harder, sharper, and more personally than ever before. She wasn't just fighting to tear down a fence anymore. She was fighting to protect her throne. And as the days passed, her tactics would grow darker, setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the entire community to its core. Margaret was cornered, and she knew it. For years she had reigned over the neighborhood like a monarch with her clipboard as a crown. But Daniel's fence had cracked the foundation of her rule. And when people like Margaret felt their power slipping, they didn't retreat quietly. They doubled down. Her campaign against Daniel grew bolder. New violation letters arrived almost daily. One accused him of having weeds in his lawn, despite his yard being immaculate. Another claimed his trash bins had been left out too long, though neighbors swore they'd seen him bring them in on time. The HOA fined him for everything from a slightly crooked mailbox flag to a car parked a few inches over the driveway line. It was clear these weren't honest violations, they were targeted attacks. Margaret wanted to bury Daniel under paperwork, fines, and threats until he gave up. But Daniel kept meticulous records, photographing his lawn, time-stamping his trash bins, and logging every detail. Each false claim became another piece of evidence in his growing file against the HOA. As the harassment escalated, so did Margaret's personal attacks. She began spreading rumors at block gatherings, whispering that Daniel was unstable, that he was ruining property values with his prison wall fence. She even claimed he was planning to sue the entire neighborhood, hoping to turn public opinion against him. But her efforts backfired. The more she attacked, the more people saw through her. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now openly questioned her motives. They whispered about her hypocrisy, how her own backyard shed was technically out of compliance, how her nephew's truck had been parked overnight without consequence, how rules only seemed to apply when it benefited her. Daniel stayed quiet in public, letting the storm swirl around him. But in private, he was preparing his next move. He knew Margaret wasn't just going to stop. She was too invested, too obsessed with winning. If he wanted to truly end this, he needed to hit back in a way that couldn't be ignored. So he filed a formal complaint with the state agency that oversaw homeowners associations, attaching every letter, photo, and record he had collected. He included the cease and desist notice, the false violations, and the evidence of selective enforcement. It was a mountain of proof that painted a damning picture of abuse of power. Weeks later, an official notice arrived in Margaret's mailbox. An investigation had been launched into the HOA's practices. Inspectors would be reviewing records, interviewing residents, and examining whether the board had overstepped its authority. When the news spread, it was like a spark in dry grass. Neighbors buzzed with excitement. For the first time, someone had stood up to the HOA, not just with defiance, but with action that could bring real consequences. Margaret panicked. At the next board meeting, her composure cracked. She raised her voice, accused Daniel of orchestrating a witch hunt, and tried to rally the board into doubling fines. But several members, now fearing legal repercussions, began distancing themselves. Some even sided with Daniel publicly, admitting the board had gone too far. The once unshakable president was suddenly isolated. Her clipboard no longer commanded respect. It was a symbol of everything the neighborhood had grown to resent. Meanwhile, Daniel continued reinforcing his fence, adding final touches that made it not just functional but beautiful. Decorative caps, climbing vines, and solar lights turned it from a fortress into a landmark. What Margaret had tried to paint as an eyesore had become one of the most admired features of the street. Still, Margaret wasn't finished. Humiliation only made her more desperate. Late at night, she drafted letters filled with veiled threats, warning homeowners that siding with Daniel would have consequences. She hinted at special assessments, rule changes, and lawsuits. She believed fear would win back what respect could not. But what Margaret didn't realize was that her time was running out. The investigation was closing in, neighbors were uniting, and Daniel's quiet resilience had transformed into open defiance. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would decide not just the fate of the fence, but the future of the entire HOA. The investigation into the HOA arrived like a storm cloud over the neighborhood. Inspectors began showing up unannounced, combing through stacks of paperwork, financial records, and violation logs. Their presence was quiet but powerful, a reminder that Margaret's authority no longer went unquestioned. Residents watched as board members were pulled aside for interviews. Clipboards were no longer symbols of control, but evidence waiting to be dissected. The HOA's own records betrayed them. Violations handed out inconsistently, fines applied selectively, and exceptions granted to Margaret's friends. Neighbors who once feared speaking out now found their voices. Families stepped forward, recounting years of intimidation, fines for minor infractions, warnings for harmless decorations, and threats for questioning the rules. The inspectors listened carefully, documenting every detail. Piece by piece, the picture became clear. The HOA had been operating less like a community association and more like a personal fiefdom. For Margaret, the walls were closing in. Her confident stride faltered. At board meetings, her voice cracked under the weight of questions she couldn't answer. Financial discrepancies emerged, pointing to HOA funds being spent on projects that seemed to benefit her personally. Landscaping contracts awarded to her cousin, community events catered by her friend's business. Each revelation cut deeper into her credibility. Daniel watched quietly as the tide shifted. His fence, once the center of controversy, was no longer on trial. Instead, it stood as the backdrop to a much larger story, a neighborhood taking back its power. Neighbors who had once muttered discontent behind closed doors were now united, their courage fueled by the sight of someone who had dared to say no and followed through. The board began fracturing. 2 members resigned outright, unwilling to be associated with Margaret's sinking ship. Others started siding openly with the community, apologizing for past actions and promising reform. Margaret was left isolated, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. But even that symbol had lost its grip. Then came the day of the community meeting, one unlike any other. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. The air was electric with anticipation. For years, Margaret had ruled these meetings, her gavel silencing dissent. But this time, the room was not hers to control. The inspectors presented their findings. Violations of state HOA statutes, misuse of funds, and evidence of selective enforcement all piled up into a damning conclusion. The board had failed in its duty to the community, and the responsibility pointed straight at Margaret. Gasps filled the room as the words sank in. Margaret's face burned red, her composure crumbling. She tried to shout over the crowd, to dismiss the findings as lies, but the voices of the neighborhood drowned her out. People who had once feared her now jeered openly, their anger finally breaking free. Daniel sat near the back, watching as the woman who had tried to destroy him unraveled in front of everyone. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply observed, knowing this moment was bigger than his fence. This was the neighborhood reclaiming its dignity. When the inspectors recommended that Margaret be removed as HOA president and barred from serving on the board again, the crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in years, the community felt free. The gavel that had silenced so many was taken from her hand, replaced by a vote that sealed her downfall. Margaret stormed out of the clubhouse, her heels clicking furiously against the tile. But no one followed her. The once feared ruler of the cul-de-sac had become a pariah, undone by her own obsession with control. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People smiled more, waved to one another, and spoke freely without fear of retaliation. The HOA, under temporary leadership, promised transparency and fairness moving forward. And through it all, Daniel's fence remained. Strong, beautiful, and symbolic. It was no longer just a boundary of wood and steel. It was a reminder of what could happen when one person stood firm against abuse of power. But even as peace returned to the cul-de-sac, one lingering question hung in the air. Margaret was gone from the board, but was she truly finished? The weeks after Margaret's removal were some of the most peaceful the neighborhood had experienced in years. Without constant violation notices, residents finally felt free to enjoy their homes. Lawns flourished, kids played outside without judgment, and homeowners began small projects they had long delayed out of fear of fines. The air was lighter, almost celebratory, as if the cul-de-sac itself had taken a deep breath. Daniel's fence became something of a landmark. Visitors admired it, neighbors praised it, and families saw it as more than just wood and steel. It was the line in the sand that had sparked a revolution. What Margaret had tried to paint as an eyesore had instead become a symbol of resilience. But Margaret herself hadn't disappeared. Stripped of her title and humiliated, she retreated into her home. Curtains drawn, blinds shut, and a for sale sign conspicuously absent from her yard. To some, it seemed she was quietly nursing her pride, perhaps waiting for the gossip to fade. To others, it was clear she was plotting. Margaret was not the type to surrender gracefully. Her final act came suddenly. One morning, neighbors awoke to find Daniel's fence vandalized. Several boards had been ripped from the posts, scratches gouged deep into the wood, and a spray-painted message scrawled across the surface. "This isn't over." The sight stunned the street. It was petty, destructive, and desperate. The clear mark of someone unwilling to let go. But Margaret had underestimated her neighbors. For years they had cowered under her authority, too afraid to speak out. Now, united, they stood firm. Several residents came forward immediately, having seen her prowling around the street late at night. Others revealed doorbell camera footage that captured her slipping into Daniel's yard under cover of darkness. The evidence was undeniable. Police arrived at Margaret's door, their presence drawing a small crowd of neighbors who watched silently as she was questioned. Her furious protest rang out across the street, but this time no one came to her defense. The same woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with fear now stood exposed and powerless, caught by the very people she had tormented. Margaret faced charges for vandalism and trespassing. Though the legal consequences were her own to bear, the true punishment was social. Every neighbor she had once intimidated now looked at her with disdain. She had gone from feared leader to neighborhood disgrace, her reputation shattered beyond repair. Daniel, meanwhile, repaired his fence swiftly. Neighbors rallied to help, bringing tools, paint, and spare boards. What Margaret had tried to destroy became stronger than before, reinforced, restored, and more admired than ever. Under the soft glow of newly added lights, the fence stood as a final, unshakable statement. No amount of intimidation could tear it down. As the sun set on that day, the cul-de-sac finally felt whole. The HOA, reformed under new leadership, began working with, not against, the community. Residents laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed a freedom they hadn't known in years. And Daniel, standing quietly by his towering fence, knew that this chapter was closed. He hadn't asked to lead a movement, but in standing up for his own home, he had given his neighbors the courage to stand up for theirs. Margaret's downfall wasn't just the end of her reign. It was the final nail in the coffin of fear that had ruled the street. The fence she had tried to tear down became the monument to her failure, and the enduring symbol of a neighborhood that had finally reclaimed its power.